Good morning and welcome to today's webcast, Building Back Better from COVID-19, Align Stakeholders and Digitize Payments. We will be saving time at the end of the webcast to answer your questions. To ask our presenters a question, please type it in the Q&A window and click Submit. If we don't have time to answer your question, we will do our best to follow up with you after the webcast. In addition to today's presentation, Moss Adams has many resources to help you navigate COVID-19. You can find links to these resources in the slide deck and handouts widget to the left of the slide view. Finally, the material appearing in this presentation is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as advice of any kind, including, without limitation, legal, accounting, or investment advice. I'm pleased to introduce today's moderator, Craig Vercruysse. Craig has nearly 20 years of healthcare leadership experience and, certified in Lean, has specialized in the application of Lean methodologies in healthcare for more than a decade. In this capacity, he leads the Lean healthcare practice at Moss Adams. And with that, I will turn it over to Craig to get us started.
Thank you so much, Emily, and welcome to all of our guests across the country. We have a wonderful turnout for our webcast today about aligning stakeholders and digitizing payments. Remember that we've put together these sessions of Building Back Better for two reasons. One, we want to follow your lead in terms of the topics you want to cover, what's important to you as we navigate this world that we're in with the pandemic particularly affecting healthcare. And secondly, we wanted to make sure that as we're putting together the content, we're keeping an optimistic lens. Now is not the time to fall back towards fear. Now is the time to move towards learning, to move towards growth, to move towards transformation. And we believe with the guests we've assembled today, they have some incredible insights on how we can transform the billing, payment, and collections ecosystem and aligning the stakeholders to really ultimately go back to patient value, consumer value. And we talk a lot about consumerism. It's very much a driving force in this topic as well. So today, the goal of our discussion is to talk about how we bring together the stakeholders, bring them closer together so that the customer, the consumer, is getting a cleaner bill, is getting a cleaner collection process for providers and for payers, and ultimately so that after the encounter of a health episode is over, patients can go back to their daily lives. And I have a personal story on that. I'll tell you, for the last almost 2 years, I have aging parents, and my father, after a hip replacement, every 10 to 14 days, I get a phone call for him for the last year and a half, trying to sort out his bill. It's not right, everyone, and we can do better. We can do better across all stakeholders, and I'm sure many of you have loved ones that have gone through the same experience. So with that, I want to introduce our guests today. I'm very honored to welcome you to our webcast. Let's go through who's joining us, and this is some wonderful partnership from our friends at JP Morgan. So let me start with you, Mike. Mike Manna is an Executive Director of Treasury Services in Healthcare Banking at JP Morgan. Mike serves as the Healthcare Industry Solutions Specialist for the Eastern United States within the commercial banking business at JP Morgan. He provides consultative services for Treasury and payment teams and assists the firm's clients to improve working capital cycle through the optimization of accounts receivable and accounts payable functions, manage liquidity, and provide forward-looking analysis of industry trends. Welcome, Mike.
Craig, thank you for having me.
And Deirdre Ruttle, Chief Marketing Officer of Instamed at JP Morgan. Deirdre is the Chief Marketing Officer there, and she also heads wholesale payments for healthcare marketing at JP Morgan. Her experience includes a deep focus in healthcare payment research, fueled by expertise in marketing and e-commerce platforms. For the last 8 years, Deirdre has led delivery of the report Trends in Healthcare Payments, an annual report, which informs about the impacts of healthcare payments for all stakeholders, providers, payers, and consumers. In addition to marketing and product management leadership positions at Instamed, Deirdre has worked with some of the country's largest payers to roll out healthcare payment solutions for both B2B and C2B payments. And I'll tell you, I've read the Trends in Healthcare Payments annual report. Deirdre, a wonderful piece. I'd recommend you all take a look at it and glean the knowledge from it. So welcome, Deirdre. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Craig. Happy to be here.
And then finally, my partner in Moss Adams, Will Norris. Will and I have collaborated on a number of projects together, and And let me tell you a little bit about Will. He's got nearly 3 decades in healthcare consulting and has worked with some of the nation's largest HMOs and capitated payers. He focuses on managed care and provider operations and payer insurers, medical groups, and the IPA environments. And he specializes in the operational infrastructure, claims processing, utilization, referrals management, eligibility, contracting, revenue recovery, you name it. And I just add, Will's an industrial engineer by training, so he has a very keen eye for process and where defects might lie and how we can make it better. So welcome, Will.
Thank you, Craig. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, let's move on to the start. We always like to start the Building Back Better with a question. What are we learning right now on the billing, payment, and collections front? What are we learning? Deirdre, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So when we look at what's happening and we take, of course, a step aside and not focus on how terrible this is and how much this has strained our healthcare system. And I will say to everyone who's on the line, who's making an impact in helping our country get better and dealing with this on the front lines, thank you. I certainly don't want to take anything away from that piece of this. But when we look at this from a technology standpoint, there are actually some positives here. Healthcare can adopt technology rapidly. We've seen it happen in COVID-19 and the quarantine that the country has been under. And it's happening quickly. And you see this happening in telehealth and the number of visits that have gone from relatively small to a large number very, very quickly. And so I think what we're seeing is that this rapid adoption of technology that consumers have wanted for a long time from healthcare can happen. And we're seeing positive results. We're seeing positive indicators within those experiences that consumers are having. And this can be a positive here. And it can show that healthcare can follow a digital adoption and a digital approach that many other industries have taken for decades at this point that can really improve the experience for all stakeholders, consumers, payers, and providers.
Definitely a note of optimism in that one. We can do it, and we can do it overnight. Thank you, Deirdre. Let's just do a round robin on this one. Mike, how about you? What are we learning from your perspective?
First of all, I echo what Deirdre said about our healthcare workers, truly the heroic efforts that some folks are making. And I think it's part of the challenge that we have to face is that we have to get past the human element of this and look at it a little more analytically from a business perspective. And so I want to frame my responses in that context. But I think what we're learning relative to the business of healthcare is that partial digitization will never drive full automation. And what we're trying to do is move our billing and insurance-related tasks to full automation. To do that, we have to have data that's digital. And we haven't done a great job of that in healthcare. So meaningful use legislation helped. It helped with the electronic health record. I think we're well over 90% at electronic health records. But as you can see on the slide from CAQH, the actual billing and insurance-related digital transactions still have a long way to go. In terms of submitting a healthcare bill, we're great. We're up in the upper 90 percentiles. But some of those categories, claim attachments or coordination of benefits, we're still in the single or low teens. If we don't have data that's digital, we can't drive the advanced automation that we're looking to try to achieve. So robotic process automation, analytics, artificial intelligence, all of that requires machine-sensible data first as the input to that automated process. And a 40, 50, or 60, or even 70% solution isn't enough. We were living with that prior to this environment because we were always able to fall back to the analog solution with our staff that was in their office and we could move physical artifacts around. We don't have that luxury right now. And so I think what we're learning is that we have to travel down the full path to get to complete digitization to move to full automation.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Now, Will, you spend a lot of time in the payer space, deep inside the payer space. What are you learning?
Right. Well, it's interesting, and I feel like healthcare has come a long way with the digitization and automation that's happening. However, as somebody who consults to payers daily and regarding their internal operation, I guess in some ways I'm constantly reminded and at times astounded on how much more work there is to do to bring us on par with other industries. I mean, I know, on the front lines and the care delivery and patient experience, I feel like we've come a long way, and there's a lot of technology that's being implemented, and telemedicine and wearable devices and so on and so forth. However, in the back office, in that transaction space, I see a lot of opportunity for improvement. I work with a lot of payers who are really trying to enhance that and become more automated. But the reality of it is right now, they're not quite there. They see it; it's on the horizon. They're looking at it as a priority. And it can be done. There's a lot of technology and applications that are out there. They just need to make it a real focus of their efforts, and the technology will come, and the operational sophistication will come as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Will. And, I've been surprised as I've worked in healthcare, both inside the delivery system as well as in consulting, at how archaic still many of the processes are. And in this particular topic, billing, payment, and collections, there are a lot of handoffs. And since the electronic health record went into place, I remember when we put that into our acute care setting, just the conversations with clinicians about how important they were now to the revenue cycle. And they weren't before. And that was a change. And then you see all of the changes that have come since then. But most importantly, in the work I do with Lean, we talk about the cost of poor quality. Whenever you have more handoffs and you don't have automation that, Mike was talking about and Deirdre were talking about, the cost of that poor quality or the cost of the defect or the mistake is great. And I think Mike, you hit it on the head here by showing just how far we've come, but how much further we need to go. Deirdre, you mentioned telehealth. We turned overnight. Are we turning overnight towards digitization in the billing, payment, and collection space? And if not, what's the catalyst? What's going to drive us to do it? We had a really compelling reason to do it in telehealth.
I'm not going to say we're changing overnight, but I think that we are going to, and we're already seeing it from data that we're looking at on our platform, that the increase in digital payments within healthcare. Because when you take a step back, you look at the experience that we're having as a country and really as a world, and the word contactless is something that we now use in daily conversations. And sure, there were some of us that talked about contactless, but pre-COVID-19, but that contactless experience and, that contactless payments and everything that goes along with those expectations is certainly applies to healthcare. And we're certainly seeing, health systems, provider practices and health plans put more priority around this because their consumers and their patients, their members, the consumers that we all serve are demanding it. And that is going to accelerate these changes. And I think that we can see that it can happen through other technology that I referenced before. And I truly believe that these requirements are going to accelerate that digitization piece in the payments experience.
So are we in a case of, in the billing, payments, and collection space, evolve or die? I mean, are we truly in this space?
I think we're going to get close. I mean, I think we should all take a step back and think about personal experiences. Do we want to have payment experiences that are manual, that involve lots of human interaction, that involve paper, that involve, we're having to be close to someone and talk through a payment experience? That's not what we want. We think about everything that we're doing in our daily lives. Most of us are trying to have as many contactless experiences as possible. And I think that the thought that healthcare can stay 1-2 decades behind in terms of the digital experience. I think that's going to disappear in a COVID-19 world. And I'm purposely not saying a post-COVID-19 world, because I think that so much of what is happening right now is going to influence the way that we interact in so many ways forever. And even when there's a vaccine and things are a little bit back to normal. But I think that as consumers, things are going to stick with us in terms of how we want to interact with each other, and certainly with businesses, and certainly within the healthcare industry.
Mm-hmm. And Mike, you talked a little bit about evolution as well when you were speaking about, just the workers, the people doing the work now also in remote settings, and what that means. Deirdre's got very much the consumer side. Maybe you and Will can speak a little bit about what it means to actually operate the business.
Yeah, Greg, I'm thinking of the phrase evolve or die. And as dramatic as it sounds, I think there's a lot of truth to that. Certainly, I don't know if that means that the entities will evolve or die, but our processes simply need to evolve. And Deirdre did a great job of talking about the consumer demand for digitization, and how that's going to drive kind of a change in mindset in the way in which providers engage with their consumers, their patients. I think we're going to see that same sort of evolution occur between providers and payers. In the past, that has been a great deal of tension between those two stakeholders. It's almost been looked at as a zero-sum game. The only way a provider can win is if a payer loses, or vice versa. I think what COVID has shown us is that it really is a continuum. It really is an ecosystem. And just as the providers need to access the patients, which represent the demand, which is owned by, in many cases, by the payers, so the payers, which own the demand, the members, they need access to supply. They need access to providers. And if it's one thing we're seeing, especially with the smaller independent provider, is that, and even actually the large systems, is there's a real cash crunch right now. Liquidity is drying up. Working capital is starting to be squeezed. And we're starting to see payers realize that they may have to inject cash into a provider network just to keep that provider network viable so that their members have a place to go. And what's interesting about that is it's not just a financial transaction, right? At that point, we're starting to build collaboration, and maybe that's where we can start to get to more digital engagement, not just as what Deirdre talked about between the consumer and the provider, but I think these closer collaborations are going to allow us to establish better digital engagement between payers and providers. And that's been lacking too.
So maybe it's partner and collaborator die. We're all in this together is really the message here. So that's a really good point. Will, what would you add to this part of the conversation?
Yeah, no, I agree. Partner and collaborate are the right terms, Greg. And it's also what's in our title of this presentation. It's align the stakeholders. And I also like the term synchronize. And we were recently engaged by a large health plan to assess the provider experience. Kudos to the health plan for, excuse me, really looking at that and taking it on. And what is their journey? What is the provider journey? Excuse me. And a key takeaway was that there was, the health plan did not have near the engagement that there needed to be. In some ways, the providers, I think their feeling was they were an afterthought. And this was borne out and evident by the amount of waste and delays and errors and manual processes that were in place, performing the services that the payer was doing for the provider. And it was very laborious. And it was interesting because certainly the payer has its own inefficiencies, but they were also self-inflicting some of their provider frustrations, meaning that they weren't engaging and investing the time with the provider on the front end of onboarding, of orientation, of training. And what that would do is down the cycle, that would turn into payment errors. That would turn into authorizations that were incorrect. And I think it really opened the eyes to the health plan as, wow, from the word go, we have to engage and collaborate with our providers and create that synergy and create that alignment to really make this effective, start to finish.
So a very practical example there, Will, a real story. And, maybe a message to everybody out there is if you don't have the really strong foundation and collaboration that gets even down to the process level. I mean, it's one thing to have meetings with your payers and payers with your providers and, be talking about the state of the business and going over the key metrics. But if you're not actually architecting and engineering a better way together, that may be something you need to undertake. And I think that's a message across all three of you that you've said is that collaboration, that level of detail collaboration, and then the digitizing it is definitely a theme of this conversation so far. So what's the implications if it doesn't happen? I mean, if you don't collaborate or die, if you sit in your silo, what implications do you think providers or payers are in for? Any one of you?
Sure, I'm happy to take that question. I think that the implications are, the all stakeholders suffer. And I think that when you look at healthcare, we are in a tri-party system with providers, payers, and consumers. And we've touched on this point earlier, but I think that it's so critical now, and it certainly ties into this collaboration theme. But when we're not looking at these stakeholders as where can all of them benefit, and certainly data and money moving electronically at a lower cost and a faster speed certainly benefits all of those stakeholders. I think that that's the positive. The negative is, and the potential implication without that collaboration is that we don't move forward and we don't bring healthcare, the healthcare payments experience and billing experience and consumer experience up to par with other industries. And I think that when you look at headlines, maybe pre-COVID, of course, when you look at headlines, healthcare organizations want this and consumers want this. They want better experiences, and they don't want to be seen as, certainly providers and payers don't want that healthcare payments experience to look archaic and feel archaic, and consumers are sick of it, right? To be blunt, when you start to look at the consumer data, consumers are very clearly saying they want these experiences that are much more similar to what happens in other industries as opposed to a paper-based, conflicting, confusing experience that's very typical in healthcare payments today.
Great. Thank you, Deirdre.
And Deirdre, I would add to that, and Craig, I think specifically also to the point, and that is when private industry can't fill a gap, public policy usually does. And I don't know which one of those is better, but I am optimistic that private industry can fill this gap. So I'm gonna choose to not answer your question by saying I think we will solve the problem. But if it doesn't get solved, I think we'll see public policy have to step in and try to solve it for us. If it's one thing that we're beginning to fully appreciate is that having access to healthcare is as much an infrastructure, a national infrastructure conversation as it is a business conversation, right? And we've known that with critical access care for a long time. But if we don't solve it ourselves, someone will try to solve it for us.
Truly. Well, I want to move over to our first polling question and see what our audience has to say. And as a reminder to everyone who's listening in, we do have some questions already coming in for our Q&A session towards the end. So please use that Q&A to tee up your question as well, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. But before we move on to the next section where we're talking about consumers a little bit more deeply, I want to ask you all, how far has your organization evolved in fully digitizing your administrative transactions? I mean, you saw the slide, you've heard the discussion. We're very interested in hearing where our audience is at on this continuum. So let's just take a moment here, then we'll see where the results are. Make sure you select one and hit submit, and we realize it's a highly subjective question, but it just gives us some directional windage. We'll just take a few more seconds. Well, let's see the results, and we'll see what our guests think about the results here too. So is this kind of result consistent with what you're seeing in your experiences, everyone? It looks like, we're somewhat there, but not all the way. Very much like the graph, it seems, that you showed, Mike. Any surprises in this data that we're getting from the audience?
Sadly, no.
Sadly, no.
Yeah, and no surprise. And I think largely it's because our efforts have been somewhat disjointed. We move ahead in different areas of the revenue cycle and back office operations. But again, I think the environment we're in is going to be a pretty good catalyst to maybe be more intentional in our approach to some of these issues.
Yeah. Well, what's also might be helpful is if some of you could paint a picture. Maybe you, Mike, could say, what does good look like? I mean, the 19% out here that say they're highly digitized, what's it look like? And how do you get there? Practical advice for the other 73% or so that are in B and C. And those that are in D, they just need to start moving up the ladder. But, those that want to get to greater than 75%, what are you seeing? What's good look like?
So it's a fantastic question. And part of the challenge is we have so many different specialties or niches within the billing and collection process of revenue cycle, where there's a huge vendor continuum, each one bringing their own particular solution. I think what you're the way in which we get to a more fulsome digitization is to try to find the source of the analog, the paper or whatever the manual process is, and suppress the manual process at that point, as opposed to truncate it somewhere further down the line. So I'll give a very specific bank-focused example, which is, banks for long periods of time have offered a lockbox process by which paper remittances will come in and the bank will convert those into an electronic file so they could be posted, whether those be patient payments or explanation of benefits or explanation of payments. That's an example of paper truncation. The document started as an analog document, as a piece of paper, and then it was truncated and digitized. Really what we want to get to is true suppression, which is those transactions should never have started as paper. Whether that means full enrollment in EFT, ERA with your payers, your insurance companies, or a truly digital engagement strategy with your consumers, so they're not writing checks to you anymore, or we've even seen people write credit card numbers and mail them in, right? That's where I think we need to go. We need to go to suppressing analog functions as opposed to just truncating them. And where do you start? I think you start with the major vendors that you already have in place, as opposed to looking to new vendors, because we're going to collapse under just vendor management if we keep trying to bring in new players. And then it's up to us, those vendors that are already in the ecosystem, to offer those digital solutions, right? If all we're doing is refining an inefficient process as opposed to putting a better process in place, we're not doing anyone any favors.
Craig, I think you might be on mute.
I think I might be on mute. You're right. That's the first time I've done that in 4 shows, and it's the most commonly said phrase in American business right now. You're on mute. Anyway, so Mike, thank you for the response on that. I want to move over to consumers and go a little bit deeper. Deirdre, you're our expert here on consumers. You've authored this wonderful piece with your team on consumer trends. Can you go a little bit deeper into what the consumers are demanding and maybe even what you see those demands looking like in the next few years and how they'll evolve?
Sure, happy to talk through that. Also, before I get into that, I think just to piggyback on what Mike was talking about in terms of practical examples and how this can really, how to realize this within an organization, I think one of the things that we need to get more comfortable with within healthcare is talking about money and talking about the fact that there will be patient responsibility or, from a payer's perspective, that your members do have responsibility. They may have a premium payment to make. And I think for a long time, it's been a taboo topic in healthcare. And I think that we need to take a step back and think about experiences like, and I know this is a little bit of a bad comparison right now, but when you check into a hotel, you know that you're going to owe some money at the end of that stay. And you're going to be asked for a credit card, and you're going to give that credit card as a consumer, and you're likely not going to put up a fight. And hotels are not in the business of collecting from consumers who stay in their properties and then leave. When you think about what happens in the healthcare experience, often money isn't part of any of that conversation within check-in, within appointment scheduling, within any touch point with that patient. And these are some of the practical things that we talk about and work with providers, large and small, every day. Bring that conversation sooner into, or first of all, have that conversation. Second of all, have that conversation sooner in that experience, and then figure out which digital tools can be utilized to bring in that automation. So if a credit card is put on file, then that credit card can be charged once a claim has been adjudicated, et cetera. And so I think that thinking about those things or thinking about that conversation around money within healthcare is something that's really important. And I think that consumers are actually open to it, right? There's, when you look at the stats that say 3 out of 4 consumers are confused by both medical bills as well as EOBs, there's a level of frustration and confusion out there that needs to be addressed, and talking about it could be the start of it, and then showing that process that actually has something like a digital wallet or automated email notifications when payments are going to be made, or text message notifications. Those are the types of things that consumers are very used to in other experiences that they're having, where they're spending money and they're making payments. So in terms of your next question around what does the future look like, I think that the demands that consumers have are only going to get louder. And I think that the changing, digital world in general, let alone the impacts of COVID-19, and the fact that millennials are the biggest generation in the workforce, are going to accelerate these needs for digital experiences. And I think that the impact is there will be there's absolutely data out there that shows that millennials are loyal to experiences and not necessarily people. And that sounds a little crass when I say it, but it's the truth. And many of those experiences that people become very loyal to are digitally driven. They're cost efficient, but they're done well, and they're done consistently, and they're done in a way that's very clear. We need to get there in healthcare, and we're seeing signs of it, and we're seeing organizations prioritize it. But I think that that's going to be a theme as we go, into the second half of 2020 and certainly beyond.
And to throw some data behind that, Deirdre, I think your report said 65% of people would be willing to switch. Is it plans? Or is it providers?
Yeah, so when you look at that data across generation, across gender, socioeconomic status, everything at the highest level, it's, 65% of consumers would consider switching providers for a better healthcare billing and collections experience. When you dig into the data even more and look at it just within the millennial generation, you're close to 90%. And so these are some of the statistics and some of the data that, again, comes from a very diverse population by all those attributes I just listed of the way that we think about experiences now. And I think it's important when we think about healthcare, we're certainly thinking about healthcare, but consumers don't have different brains, right? You don't have a brain that thinks, okay, this is what I expect in healthcare, and it can be, 10, 20 years ago, and then this is what I expect from everything else. We're humans, and our brains think about, we think about our experiences collectively. And finally, I think the fact that everyone on this call likely has a cell phone or a smartphone within arm's reach of them, that has also changed our brains, and it's changed what we expect from experiences. We expect them to be immediate. We expect them to meet our needs. It's very much me focused, the proverbial me, and so that's certainly influencing what's happening.
When I've been involved in re-engineering processes inside of a clinical setting, we always talk about the value of time. Why do we check how much time each step takes? How much time are people waiting in a waiting room? The value of people's time in the billing and payment and collections is equally important. So I think your point about people being loyal to their time not being wasted, ease, and it makes me wonder, Will, you're deep inside of the payers. What's the you talked about the conversation about what's the process with their providers. What's it like with their members? Are they worried about this? I mean, there should be alarm bells going off everywhere based on the data that Deirdre is showing in the payer space about switching, as well as the provider space. What do you see there?
Well, yeah, what I'm struck with is you talked about the experience. That is the key for moving forward, and especially as we become more virtual across the board. Think telehealth. What I'm struck by is, provider-patient bond, that loyalty that's always been there. What's going to happen to that in the long run? And so that will no longer be a key criteria for loyalty and for maintaining membership. It'll be the experience that the member has. It will be I'd like to use this term, hassle factor. It'll be minimizing the hassle factor for the consumer, and equally as much for the provider. That prior project that I mentioned, boy, all we were hearing was, the provider experience. It was so laborious and tedious, and so many forms to fill out, and all these type of things. And I think it's the same for the consumer, who wants it simplified. They want it digital, contactless, and I know that on the heels of this provider experience project, we were tagged to do a customer patient experience. So again, this health plan was very focused, had the right line of sight on what they were trying to do. There's work to be done, but they had the right position on collaboration with the providers, with the members, and get this to a more, digitized and automated way. I mean, that really is the future. In the next 3 to 5 years, the billing, payment, and collection landscape requires more automation, more responsiveness, cost effectiveness, and really a reduction in the overall errors and defects that currently occur in that back office on the billing, payment, and collection cycle.
And Mike, maybe a last word on this consumer piece. And of course, we just learned this past week, Walmart's getting into the insurance space too, right? So on top of it, and if you're feeling so inclined to make a comment about that, that'd be great. But, you've talked a little bit about, brand identity when we were preparing for this call a bit. What would you share with the group on the consumer front, consumerism front? You're on mute, Mike. I did it. Oh, yeah, there you go. Maurice. Mike, we still think you're on mute. while Mike is checking out what's happening with the audio there, why don't we move over to a polling question? Sorry about the mute challenges, everybody. But let's move over to a polling question from the group. And, we've talked a lot about partner and collaborate to improve the system, digitizing. We've talked about consumerism. And we really want to get a feel for, in the near term, we're talking the second half of this year. What are some of your top priorities in the billing, payment, and collections improvement arena in Q3 and Q4? And you can choose as many as you like. There's a little bit of a scroll bar here, and you can pick other and fill in some blanks, but we would love to hear what your priorities are. So let's just take a moment. And then we're going to wrap it up with a question from each of our guests and then move into the Q&A, which I see about 7 or 8 questions that we'll have some time for. Okay, just take another few seconds. And let's see where our results are. It looks like it's a tie for first, so much deeper provider plan collaboration. That's wonderful. And then we also see prioritizing the patient financial experience and the digitization and automation. So this group is very much in line with where our guests are suggesting to go, which is fantastic. And sounds like there's, if we're talking Q3 and Q4, there's some urgency maybe even in our audience about moving forward and taking advantage of this period of time that we have. So with that, let's move to our final question for our guests, and then we're going to move into the Q&A. And again, a reminder, we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. But if you could put them in the Q&A box and queue them up for us, that would be great. And we'd like to end our session with our guests giving a final takeaway. And in the spirit of building back better and optimism, what's the one thing you're hopeful for as we move through the coming months and years? Deirdre, why don't you start?
Sure. So that poll makes me hopeful, and I think that there are some pretty incredible opportunities to, again, drive digitization that benefits all parties. And I am very passionate about the fact that if we could truly bring providers, payers, and consumers together in this, in the healthcare payments experience in general, let alone in the payments experience, I think that there's incredible opportunity to make this a better experience, a more positive experience, change the trajectory of some of the dissatisfaction stats that we hear all the time, and then put the money and so much of the waste that happens in healthcare, put it back into why we're actually all here, right? We want to keep the population healthy. We want to cure diseases. We want to, we want the money spent on those really important human aspects of healthcare. And so I am finding hope and I see a path for how healthcare can get there. And it's certainly, I would never wish this time upon any of us and the world. But if we need to, if we do look for things that can be better and ultimately help a crisis like we're in now, it could be, let's take the billions of dollars of waste in terms of the payment experience out of healthcare and put it back where it belongs, which is in the patient. And more importantly, it's within the people.
Deirdre, that's great. It's just painting the picture of everybody can truly win if they work together is a great aspiration. And I would take what you said further about the value created and the waste eliminated and reinvesting in the things that are most important, maybe even a step further. McKinsey Insights just published a new paper this week about health being a priority for the productivity and prosperity of our society. So even taking it a step further beyond our health to say our health and well-being as communities and society is the beneficiary of this as well. So thank you for painting that picture of optimism. Will, one thing you hope for? going forward?
Yeah. Yes, I would echo a lot of what Deirdre said. Being, as you heard, where my specialty is, I'm hopeful for a much more sophisticated and streamlined process on the back end, which is really what we're talking about today, the payment cycle, utilizing automation and digital technology. And like I mentioned before, and I use this term probably too often, but the hassle factor is a differentiator going forward. It really is for the consumer, for the provider, and let's face it, for providers, I mean, there's a lot of stressors that are out there right now, currently and post-COVID. There's less providers. You're going to have big volume fluctuations in patient activity, and you're going to have stresses on the adequacy of networks. So what you have to do as a payer is really embrace those providers, bring them in, and engage with them, and really partner up and collaborate. And I think that, to me, seeing that will be a huge differentiator moving forward from where we are today.
That's a great one, Will. And our data shows that 43% of people are focusing on those collaborations. So that's a good sign. Mike, how about you? One thing you're hopeful for going forward.
First of all, Craig, am I back?
You're back. I hear you.
Oh, excellent.
You hear me?
Terrific. So,
all right.
I can. So going forward, first of all, stability of technology, I think, is something that I'm looking forward to. But actually, all trivialness aside, I think what we've discovered is that we've got a lot of technology at our fingertips, and we're able to respond as an industry very rapidly. I think that's one of the takeaways, perhaps, from COVID. And so going forward, I'd like to see the fact that we've maybe gotten some confidence in our ability to change, and we've certainly seen where the cracks are in the current state. And whether that be in digitization between payments, between consumers and providers, whether that be collaboration between payers and providers. One of the things that drew me to the title of this webcast, quite frankly, Craig, was the notion of building back better. And I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to do that. I think what is probably at the highest level still kind of an open issue is ultimately who is the consumer going to turn to as the trusted voice in healthcare? Is it going to be their provider? And Deirdre shared some examples about how there's a bit of a disconnect there, how the friction of that relationship relative to just billing and payments may change the relationship between a consumer and a provider. Or is the consumer going to turn to the payer to be their voice of truth in their healthcare journey? And that's still an open question. And to me, that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out, which is who's going to own the share of the mind of the consumer? Is it going to be the payer or the provider?
Mm-hmm. Good question to end with. And speaking of which, let's move to our questions from the audience. And we have a bunch of them. And I'm going to read one of them, but it's emblematic of several that I'm seeing in the Q&A box here. And one person says, aren't the insurance companies and their claims evaluation cycle the problem with providing a patient a clear view of their out-of-pocket burden prior to the procedure or the purchase of some kind of prescribed device? We are working on a payment solution focused on optimizing out-of-pocket healthcare payments for patients. We should be able to hook into an insurance plan database that refers to QPT codes, provides clarity on billing earlier. And there's kind of this theme in several of the questions about a little bit of a chicken and egg. Does it start with the payers? Does it start with the providers? Where do we optimize first? I guess is, you can answer maybe the specific question here, but maybe the general one is also applicable. Who would like to take that one?
Craig, I'll start, but I'm sure we all have an opinion of it. And, my opinion goes back to the early 90s when I first got into RevCycle. And if you look, the question is absolutely correct. It's an inefficient system. I would say it's inelegant. And it has developed over a period of decades because each stakeholder, both the payers and the provider, was trying to, in a zero-sum mindset, game the relationship with the other. And so we started with these procedure codes that had these high list prices that would then be discounted down. as a result of a contract with a payer. And as a result, it's a very inelegant solution. You're right that the question does beg a solution, which is if we had a universal fee schedule where everyone paid the same and everyone was reimbursed the same, we'd know right off the bat what the out-of-pocket would be. But I'm not sure there are many providers that would be willing to sign up for a universal fee schedule. And I don't think there are many insurance companies that want to publish what their contracts are right now. We're seeing that play out with price transparency at a federal level. So I think it's more to it than just it's the payer's fault.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to chime in on that one? Well, let me move over to another question then. More on the human side of things. All this change we're talking about, what's it going to mean for people's jobs? You know, how are you humanizing this change is the question for healthcare staff members. Curious to learn more about reskilling, upskilling staff members, because surely there's some displacement of workers that happens through all of this. Thoughts on that?
I could start here. I have worked with health systems in the Midwest as well as on the West Coast around these shifts and, you know, talking about money and having those conversations with, with their staff and training their staff to make these, to have these upfront financial discussions. And really, it's potentially going to start out a little bit uncomfortable, but I've seen some pretty amazing programs put together that give people the tools to be able to have those conversations, give them and certainly have those conversations with empathy. That's, certainly something that's really important with children's hospitals that I've worked with, especially. That's a big theme. But the skill set can absolutely evolve. Those conversations can happen. And what I have seen in the systems that I've worked with is these jobs have really evolved and they're collecting more. So there's certainly higher collection rates, which is a positive thing for an organization. And then they put the results and the data around it. And they really create some good team collaboration, some team spirit, and even some competitiveness in terms of, which areas are collecting the most, which areas are getting the most cards on file, et cetera. And it's actually been a positive change, even when there was some trepidation about, wait, I have to talk about money in addition to everything else that I'm supposed to be doing.
That's a really good way of building this esprit de corps around it, Deirdre. Go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say, and one of the things I'd like to chime in on, if we can realign it's very much what Deirdre just said, if we can realign that staff to actually help with improving clinical care, as opposed to working on back-end receivables, I think as a nation we're actually going to improve. And so let me give a very tangible example of that. If we could take people who right now are calling insurance companies about eligibility and coordinating benefits, right? And instead repurpose those to calling our patients to see if they're following their plan adherence for their drugs, right? Where there's actually going to be an improved clinical outcome because of that human contact. I think that's a much better way to justify an FTE to a healthcare organization. And that's, I think, what the promise of full automation offers, right, is that we get out of really what's low value in terms of care delivery, back-end billing and insurance-related tasks, and we're now able to focus on delivering a higher quality of care to patients. Those jobs are going to change, but I don't think the headcount's going to go away.
Well, intrinsic in this question is a question of leadership, too. When you're talking about how do leaders show up to foster a culture that says if we're going to evolve, and we're going to transform, we're going to, what's the declaration? I remember when I was at Sutter Health at one of the big medical centers, when we launched our lean journey, one of the things we declared straight away was, we're not going to be laying anyone off because of the improvement work we're doing. We declared it. And then we had to make good on it. And many other organizations have done that as well. That puts pressure on the leadership then to do exactly what you just described, Mike, to say, how do we now create higher value jobs that have greater impact, because you know what, there's more that you can do, and we're getting you out of the waste of managing the system. So I think there's a leadership question in this too. But we've just got a few more minutes, and I want to get to a few more questions. Let's see. Oh, there's a comment here about the EOBs during COVID have been horrific. So I'm sure there are people who are agreeing with that one, and wanting a vaccine sooner rather than later, just so to get this behind us. But let's go over to one observation. Here's a good observation. You know, we've talked about digitizing, and we've talked about consumerism. You know, maybe talk a little bit about, you know, digitization as an end in itself is not necessarily the game here, but what are we really trying to achieve in terms of some of the key metrics? And if you're an organization that's going to move up the digitization curve, what should you be looking at in the short term in terms of measurable results that's going to kind of fuel the investment and get you to the space of, you know, AI that you talked about?
You know, Will probably has a number of ones that you can talk about regarding the payer side of the house. I mean, just at a high level on the provider side, some KPIs. One that's very well used right now is just day sales outstanding on the receivable side, right? Are we collecting our receivables faster? On the patient access side, there's a number of KPIs about, you know, number of pre-certs that are required for prior to surgery, the fact that you've got benefits validated prior to the first appointment, things like that. I think the KPIs are probably out there right now, and you can look at the ones that are published by HFMA and NAHAM and organizations like that, and they'll help you build the business case for a more automated experience on the receivable side. I think the payers have their own set of KPIs, though.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Mike, and there's no void of KPIs that are out there in the payer space for sure. Whether it's, you know, timeliness of claims processing, accuracy metrics, eligibility, measuring eligibility defects, you know, various turnaround times. So it absolutely, in the payer space, it is ripe, being the transaction shop that it is. It is ripe for digitization and automation in multiple areas, in multiple avenues. And it's just a matter now of like, you know, kind of focus on the many things that are, you know, pre and post COVID that are priorities. This has to be at the top of the list, because this will envelop, you know, the providers, the consumer, and the payer. And getting back to a previous question, I do think the payer is the hub of this entire cycle. And I think they need to lead the charge and really drive the change that needs to happen.
And with that, I know that we didn't get to every question, but we'll promise to follow up on them on email. I want to thank Deirdre and Mike and Will for being our guests today. I want to thank you all for great questions from the audience. And I want to echo what Deirdre led off with at the outset, which was, you know, now's the time, right? We've seen what we're capable of. I think this is a really important point. And making sure we're keeping the consumer, the patient, at the forefront of this transformation of billing, payment, and collections, making sure we're collaborating with each other, because we are all in it together. And using that technology for good to create a better healthcare system, a better world, is really the charge. And with that, I'd just like to thank you all for joining us for our fourth Building Back Better webcast, and we look forward to seeing you again on the next one. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Emily.
All right. Thank you, Craig. And thank you, Deirdre, Mike, and Will, for a great presentation today. As Craig mentioned, we are out of time. So if you had a question for our presenters that we did not get to, we will do our best to follow up with you after the webcast. If you have any other questions for our presenters, you may reach out to them directly using their contact info in the speaker bio widget. For more resources, please visit our Moss Adams COVID-19 web pages via the slide deck and handouts widget to the left of the slide view. And here is a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey, as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again next time.